Have you ever watched a $400 million company evaporate in exactly 4 seconds? I have. That is all it took for an expired license code to crash the smart grid system my former boss just bragged about on national television. He thought firing me on a 2-minute Zoom call was cutting costs. Grab a glass of bourbon, and let me tell you how I turned his arrogance into a death sentence. Hello, dear listeners of Boss Revenge Stories, and thank you for your continuous and heartfelt support. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with absolutely zero operating budget, which means we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here for the foreseeable future and move our operations entirely to Patreon. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you will gain access to even better, longer, and incredibly detailed exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code right on your screen or by clicking the direct link located in the description or the pinned comment of this very video. Now, let us dive right into today's story, where I, Hadley Nelson, will walk you through the exact moment a billion-dollar ego crumbled to dust. I am 34 years old, and until a very specific Wednesday morning, I was the chief systems architect at AeroVolt Dynamics. We were the undeniable golden child of the Austin, Texas green energy scene. Our corporate headquarters was a suffocating monument to startup excess and toxic positivity. Imagine exposed brick walls, overpriced organic kombucha flowing on tap, and an endless sea of open-plan desks designed under the guise of fostering collaboration. Though in reality, it mostly just fostered chronic anxiety and burnout. The absolute crown jewel of the entire operation was a highly complex piece of artificial intelligence I built entirely from the ground up, known as the Energy Coordination Core. It was a revolutionary system designed to dynamically distribute power from massive solar farms directly to urban electrical grids with near-perfect efficiency. I bled over those algorithms for 3 exhausting years, pulling 80-hour work weeks while surviving on stale office coffee and sheer, unfiltered willpower. But if you happen to read Forbes magazine, you would naturally assume Trent Vanderwall birthed the entire system himself during a spiritual weekend retreat in Tulum. Trent was our chief executive officer, a quintessential tech bro who lived in a standard-issue Patagonia fleece vest and possessed the kind of unearned, staggering confidence that only generational wealth can buy. He absolutely loved the camera. He loved speaking in hollow, meaningless buzzwords like synergy, disruptive paradigms, and scalable ecosystems. Most of all, he loved standing on brightly lit stages and graciously accepting prestigious industry awards for the code that my fingers had typed. That fateful Wednesday morning, the execution block was cleverly disguised as a mandatory all-hands Zoom call. The calendar invite was vaguely titled Q3 Strategic Restructuring, a sterile phrase carefully sanitized by the Human Resources Department to prevent a mass company-wide panic. I logged on from my quiet home office, watching the participant count rapidly tick past 250. The digital grid of tiny video squares filled up with the exhausted, glowing faces of my overworked colleagues. Trent's face dominated the main speaker screen. He wore his signature perfectly capped, blindingly white smile, looking exactly like a man about to proudly announce a record-breaking initial public offering. Instead, he cleared his throat and delivered a lifeless corporate monologue about streamlining critical operations and pivoting the company toward a more robust leadership matrix. It was a torrential downpour of expensive, empty words meant to mask a very cheap and calculated betrayal. He urgently needed a shiny new Chief Technology Officer title to hand over to his old college fraternity brother, a guy whose only real technological achievement in life was investing early in a cryptocurrency scam. To make room for his buddy, and to conveniently cut out my substantial equity shares right before the highly anticipated initial public offering, Trent simply had to get rid of me. And he decided the best way to do it was live, on the group call, in front of the entire company. Hadley, we deeply appreciate your foundational contributions. Trent said, leaning into the high-definition camera with an expression of poorly manufactured sympathy. But as AeroVolt transitions into a massive global enterprise, we require visionary leadership at the executive level. Therefore, today is your last day. Human Resources will email your standard severance details shortly. A heavy, suffocating digital silence immediately fell over the meeting. 250 people collectively held their breath. They fully expected a massive, dramatic meltdown. They expected tears, screaming, or at least a desperate, humiliating plea for my job. I gave them absolutely nothing of the sort. I simply sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, coldly staring at Trent's smug, pixelated face on my monitor. The sheer audacity of the man was almost impressive to witness. I calmly unmuted my microphone. My voice was completely steady, cutting through the dense silence like a surgical scalpel. And what exactly happens to the 4 algorithm patents I developed for the core, Trent? Trent actually chuckled aloud. It was a dismissive, deeply arrogant little sound that sharply echoed through hundreds of computer speakers all across Austin. He ran a hand through his expensive, styled haircut, looking directly at the camera as if I was a naive, foolish child who had somehow forgotten the basic rules of the corporate playground. "Everything you do here belongs to AeroVolt. Hadley," he said, his tone dripping with heavy condescension. "Read your contract. All intellectual property is owned entirely by the company. You are a salaried employee. The algorithms stay with us." He looked so incredibly proud of himself in that fleeting moment. He genuinely thought he had outsmarted the foundational architect of his entire empire. He thought I was just another disposable, easily replaceable cog in his green energy machine, effortlessly stripped of my life's work and cast aside to save his bottom line. I did not argue with his logic. I did not shed a single tear for my lost job. I just smiled, a slow, chilling, predatory smirk that I saw register on his confident face for just a fraction of a second. I deliberately moved my cursor over to the global chat box, typed a single, decisive line, and hit enter. "Are you sure about that?" Before Trent could even begin to formulate a coherent response, before Human Resources could scramble to lock down my corporate account, and before anyone else on the grid could fully comprehend what I meant, I manually clicked the red Leave Meeting button. Let me rewind exactly 3 years. When you join a hyper-growth tech startup in its infancy, you quickly realize that the underlying infrastructure is held together by digital duct tape, blind optimism, and caffeine. They were so intensely obsessed with scaling up, securing massive rounds of venture capital funding, and disrupting the legacy energy market that absolutely no one in the executive suite was paying attention to the boring, tedious legal paperwork. Their entire legal department at the time consisted of an overworked 22-year-old intern and a generic non-disclosure template blindly downloaded from a free legal website. I saw the glaring vulnerabilities on day one. I knew firsthand that in the ruthless, cutthroat ecosystem of modern venture capitalism, corporate loyalty is a total myth, and your only real shield is absolute leverage. So, I built an impenetrable fortress before they even knew we were standing on a battlefield. I never registered a single line of the core coordinating algorithms under my own personal name, nor did I ever submit them as an employee of the company, months before I even accepted their official offer letter. I quietly established a completely detached, legally bulletproof shell corporation called Nelson Node Limited Liability Company. It existed solely as a legal vault to house my most valuable intellectual assets. When I finally finalized my onboarding paperwork, I skillfully slipped a highly customized intellectual property addendum into the massive, chaotic stack of standard employment documents. The agreement I presented was astonishingly simple, yet incredibly lethal. The company did not actually own the foundational software driving their multi-million-dollar green energy grid. They were merely renting it from me. I granted them an exclusive enterprise-wide commercial usage license for the grand total of exactly $1 per year. The Human Resources Director, frantic to get me fully integrated into the engineering team before the third quarter ended, did not even bother to consult an actual corporate attorney. She just quickly skimmed the bold headings, saw that I was bringing my own proprietary tools at almost zero cost to their operating budget, and eagerly signed her name on the dotted line without reading a single word of the fine print. That one single, rushed signature legally bound the entire company to Clause 8B. I vividly remember writing that specific clause late one night with a profound sense of satisfaction. It was meticulously drafted, aggressively binding, and crystal clear. It stated, in unquestionable legal terminology, the enterprise usage license granted by Nelson Node Limited Liability Company shall be unconditionally and automatically terminated at the exact second the aforementioned employee is subjected to involuntary termination of employment. In plain, undeniable English, if they ever decided to fire me against my will, their legal right to use the artificial intelligence powering their entire business evaporated instantly. They were currently flying a massive, heavily funded commercial airplane, and I legally owned the engines. Returning to the present moment, sitting in my quiet home office after abruptly leaving that ridiculous video call, I felt a deep, profound sense of calm wash over me. I did not panic. I did not frantically call my industry contacts looking for a new job. I leisurely began sorting through my meticulously organized desk. I picked up a small, heavily encrypted flash drive from my top drawer. It was sleek, matte black, and completely unassuming. I plugged the drive directly into the side port of my heavily monitored corporate laptop. Now, a standard, highly emotional, disgruntled employee might try to frantically download confidential client lists, proprietary source code, or embarrassing internal emails before the information technology department completely locked them out of the network. I had absolutely zero interest in stealing data that I had already built and legally owned. I was not extracting anything from their fragile systems. I was leaving them a highly customized parting gift. My fingers flew gracefully across the mechanical keyboard, executing a highly specialized, deeply buried command script. I easily bypassed their amateur internal security protocols in less than 30 seconds. I deployed a stealth trigger, a complex digital kill switch completely undetectable to their standard system audits. It quietly embedded itself deep within the primary distribution servers, acting as a silent sleeper agent patiently waiting for the inevitable moment the company tried to run a massive system simulation without my authorized cryptographic key. The execution was completely flawless. Once the successful deployment was visually confirmed on my monitor, I smoothly pulled the drive from the port. I firmly closed the laptop screen, severing my digital tether to the company forever. I packed a small cardboard box with my personal items. I stepped out of my building and walked down to the street level, stepping right into the blistering, unforgiving heat of a standard Texas afternoon. The midday sun was blinding, but for the first time in 3 exhausting years, the heavy, suffocating pressure in my chest was completely gone. I took a deep, deliberate breath of the scorching air. I did not feel the crushing, paralyzing fear of sudden unemployment. I felt the intoxicating, absolute thrill of total freedom. The legal trap was perfectly set. The digital lock was fully engaged, and the countdown clock to the total annihilation of an arrogant empire had officially started ticking. I drove for 45 minutes straight into the deep, quiet suburbs of Austin. I was not heading to a trendy downtown cocktail bar to drown my sorrows or celebrate my sudden unemployment. Instead, I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a legendary decades-old steakhouse. It was the kind of establishment that smelled of heavily aged beef, expensive cigar smoke, and old money. The interior was deliberately kept dim, lined with heavy mahogany panels and deep red leather booths. It was not a place where people went to be seen. It was a place where ruthless people went to conduct business entirely in the shadows. Waiting for me in the most secluded corner booth was Valerie Vance. Valerie was the iron-willed chief executive officer of Meridian Grid, which just so happened to be the largest, most aggressive, and most heavily funded direct competitor to my former employer. She was a woman who had clawed her way to the very top of the male-dominated energy sector through sheer brilliance and an absolutely terrifying lack of mercy. She sat perfectly still, nursing a glass of sparkling water, her sharp eyes calculating every single step I took as I approached her table. I slid into the heavy leather seat across from her. She did not offer a handshake. She simply leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands on the dark wood. I have to admit, Hadley, when my assistant told me you demanded a private dinner, I was intensely curious, Valerie said, her voice smooth but laced with heavy skepticism. You are the primary architect of the only piece of technology that currently gives me a headache. You are the reason your arrogant boss is dominating the industry news cycle. So, tell me, why exactly is his star engineer sitting across from me on a Wednesday evening? Because as of 2 hours ago, I no longer work for him, I replied evenly. He fired me over a public video call to make room for a completely incompetent friend of his. Valerie raised a single, elegant eyebrow. The initial skepticism in her eyes shifted into a cold, clinical amusement. Trent always was a remarkably short-sighted idiot, but that still does not explain why you are here. If you are looking for a standard senior engineering role, you can submit a resume to my human resources department like everyone else. I did not say a word in response. I simply unclasped my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of physical legal documents and complex system architecture blueprints. I deliberately pushed them across the table. Valerie looked at the papers, then back at me, before she finally picked up the top document. It was the original commercial usage license between my former company and my private shell corporation. Read Clause 8B, I instructed quietly. I watched closely as Valerie's eyes scanned the dense legal text. For a woman who rarely showed any visible emotion, the slight widening of her eyes and the sudden, sharp intake of breath was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Her brilliant mind connected the dots in a matter of seconds. You own the 4 core algorithms, Valerie stated, her voice dropping to a harsh, disbelieving whisper. He does not own the patents. You do. And this clause dictates that the moment he terminated your employment, this license was completely voided. Exactly, I smiled, leaning back into the comfortable leather booth. As of this very second, they are operating a multi-million-dollar smart grid system using completely pirated, unlicensed software, and they have absolutely no idea. Their entire infrastructure is a massive legal and technical time bomb, and I hold the only detonator. Valerie set the papers down gently. The heavy skepticism was completely gone, replaced by the thrilling, predatory gleam of a corporate shark smelling blood in the water. What do you want? Hadley? She asked, stripping away all the pleasantries. I want a brutal, highly publicized transfer of power. I laid out my terms with absolute precision. I am transferring the exclusive permanent rights of all 4 patents directly to Meridian Grid. You will integrate my technology, and you will dominate the entire North American energy market. In exchange, I want the title of Vice President of Innovation at your company, a completely unrestricted operating budget, and an 8-figure compensation package. I paused for a brief moment, letting the sheer weight of the offer settle over the table, before I leaned in closer. But there is one absolutely non-negotiable condition. Valerie, you must let me personally orchestrate the exact method and timing of Trent's downfall. I want to hold the knife. Valerie did not even blink. She understood the assignment perfectly. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously crafting a ruthless, multi-tiered media and legal strategy. We agreed to absolute silence. We would not send a cease and desist letter. We would not leak a single whisper to the tech press. We decided to let Trent blindly continue his aggressive expansion. We would let him confidently walk into meetings and sign massive, legally binding government contracts based entirely on a stolen technology platform that he had already permanently lost control over. When the waiter finally arrived to clear our empty plates, Valerie ordered a bottle of their most expensive, deeply aged red wine. She poured 2 glasses, handing one to me with a look of profound, dangerous respect. I raised my glass, watching the dark liquid catch the dim light of the steakhouse. I smiled, and my eyes reflected a purely freezing, calculated anticipation. Let him climb to the absolute highest peak, I said softly, clinking my glass against hers, because the fall from up there is what truly hurts. Exactly 3 weeks later, the grand ballroom of the Austin Convention Center was entirely transformed into a glittering, high-tech temple of corporate hubris. Aerovolt was hosting a highly exclusive, meticulously orchestrated live demonstration of the Coordination Core. The stakes in that room were astronomically high. Sitting front and center, completely surrounded by an army of nervous aides and flashing press cameras, was the sitting governor of Texas, alongside the entire executive board of the Texas State Energy Commission. They were not there for a casual viewing. They were there to officially finalize an unprecedented, exclusive state infrastructure contract valued at exactly $500 million. It was the kind of massive, landscape-shifting government funding that instantly transforms a fragile startup into an untouchable tech titan. The cavernous room was absolutely buzzing with the electric, intoxicating energy of impending wealth. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated silently with expensive champagne, while eager venture capitalists confidently whispered among themselves, already calculating their massive returns on investment. Trent commanded the massive center stage, bathed in bright, dramatic theatrical spotlights. He was in his absolute, undeniable element. He paced back and forth with a wireless microphone clipped to his expensive, custom-tailored suit, gesturing grandly toward the colossal, wall-to-wall light-emitting diode screens towering behind him. The screens displayed beautifully animated, entirely hypothetical graphics of green energy flowing flawlessly across a glowing map of the state grid. He spoke with sickeningly smooth charisma, weaving a captivating, emotional narrative about his grand personal vision, his relentless dedication, and his so-called great innovation that would permanently solve the regional energy crisis. The wealthy investors in the audience nodded in deep, satisfied agreement. They were entirely captivated by the expensive illusion. Trent was not just selling them a software system, he was aggressively selling them a legacy. Completely unaware that he was proudly tap-dancing on a digital trapdoor I had meticulously rigged to swing wide open. The highly anticipated climax of the presentation finally arrived. The entire morning was specifically designed to culminate in a live, real-time simulation of the software architecture. Trent dramatically instructed his newly appointed Chief Technology Officer, his thoroughly unqualified former fraternity brother sitting in the sound booth, to prepare the heavy load capacity test. The simulation was supposed to seamlessly redirect a massive, sudden surge of simulated solar power across a complex virtual replica of the Dallas metropolitan grid. Trent turned slowly to face the governor, flashing his trademark, blinding white smile for the rolling cameras. He dramatically raised his hand, proudly declaring into the microphone that the absolute future of clean energy was finally here, and firmly pressed the oversized digital launch button glowing on his clear acrylic podium. That exact physical action, that highly specific system request to initiate a core network override without my personal cryptographic authorization, was the precise trigger my stealth script had been patiently waiting for deep in the dark. The invisible legal loophole instantly materialized into solid digital concrete. Deep inside the remote corporate servers, the dormant kill switch violently and decisively engaged. It did not just simply pause the simulation or show a buffering icon. It aggressively and permanently locked down every single foundational algorithm I had ever written for the company. The colossal, blindingly bright screens behind Trent instantly flatlined. They did not flicker. They aggressively snapped to a pitch-black void, plunging the front of the massive hall into sudden, jarring darkness. A collective, audible gasp sharply echoed through the cavernous convention center. For 3 agonizing, stretching seconds, there was absolutely nothing but blinding darkness and heavy, palpable confusion. Then, in massive, glaring, blood-red capital letters that stretched 20 feet across the dark screens, a brutal system-level warning violently illuminated the horrified faces of the VIP audience. The text read, "Fatal error. Usage license expired. Please contact Nelson Node Limited Liability Company immediately to restore critical infrastructure. A heavy, suffocating, deathly silence violently crashed down upon the entire room. You could literally hear a glass clink in the far back corner. The governor leaned forward in his leather chair, his expression instantly shifting from highly impressed to profoundly, deeply furious. Trent stood completely frozen at the podium, his arrogant, confident smile wiped away in a fraction of a second, immediately replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. A thick, visible layer of cold sweat immediately broke out across his forehead, shining under the stage lights. He frantically tapped the useless launch button on his podium again and again, then shot a wild, desperate glare at the glass control booth in the back of the hall. He aggressively signaled his technical team, waving his arms frantically like a drowning man begging for a life raft. Inside the sound booth, his new executive buddy and a dozen panicked, sweating engineers were furiously slamming on their keyboards, but they were completely, utterly helpless. My script had already automatically deployed military-grade encryption across the entire source code repository. The harder they tried to force their way in, the tighter the digital vault locked them out. They were entirely locked out of their own product. The $500 million deal evaporated into thin air right in front of a live, heavily documented audience. While the convention center descended into absolute, unprecedented chaos, I was sitting miles away in the peaceful, quiet comfort of my high-rise apartment. The late Texas afternoon breeze was delightfully warm and soothing. I was lounging comfortably on my outdoor balcony, resting my bare feet on the cool metal railing, looking out over the sparkling, vibrant city skyline. In my right hand, I held an expertly crafted, ice-cold margarita, complete with a perfectly salted rim and a fresh slice of lime. On the small glass table right next to me, my smartphone was vibrating with an aggressive, relentless, and highly satisfying intensity. The screen lit up repeatedly, brightly displaying 14 consecutive missed calls from Trent. I took a slow, incredibly satisfying sip of my drink, enjoying the sharp, sweet bite of the tequila, and casually tapped the glass screen to access my voicemail inbox. I had absolutely no intention of answering the phone. I just wanted to sit back and listen to the music. The audio recordings were an absolute symphony of corporate destruction. The first few messages were full of furious, arrogant screaming, with Trent aggressively demanding that I fix the software glitch immediately and threatening me with massive, career-ending federal lawsuits. He sounded like a furious toddler throwing a tantrum, but by the seventh voicemail, the angry, demanding shouting had drastically deteriorated into heavy, panicked breathing and desperate, frantic pleas for help. By the 12th message, his voice was actively cracking. He was literally begging me to answer the phone, promising me a massive return of my equity, an immediate executive promotion, and absolutely anything I wanted if I would just type in the password. He finally, agonizingly realized the truth. He had not just fired an annoying employee to save some money, he had arrogantly reached out and accidentally unplugged his own life support system. I let his final, pathetic voicemail play out into the quiet evening air, smiled a genuine smile at the beautiful Austin sunset, and took another long, refreshing sip of my drink. Less than 24 hours after the catastrophic presentation in front of the governor, Valerie and the formidable public relations machine at Meridian Grid flawlessly executed our pre-planned, lethal counterattack. As the morning sun rose over the shattered remnants of my former boss's reputation, a meticulously crafted press release hit every major financial and technology newswire across the entire country simultaneously. The corporate statement was brilliantly simple and devastatingly effective. It officially welcomed me, Hadley Nelson, to the executive suite of Meridian Grid as their brand new vice president of innovation. But the true killing blow was buried in the second paragraph, where they proudly announced their exclusive, legally binding acquisition of the underlying intellectual property driving the coordination core technology. The American technology media ecosystem, always hungry for a spectacular corporate disaster, absolutely exploded within minutes. The story went completely viral across every social platform and industry blog. The vicious, mocking headlines were plastered across every screen in Silicon Valley and beyond. One major publication ran a massive banner that read, "AeroVolt, shorting the future chief executive officer, fires the actual owner of his own technology." Another popular financial blog gleefully published a brutal editorial detailing how a single, arrogant video call had completely vaporized a company supposedly worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The entire industry was collectively pointing and laughing at the golden boy of green energy, stripping away his carefully constructed genius persona to reveal the incompetent fraud hiding underneath. The financial fallout was instantaneous and utterly merciless. On the secondary market, where eager investors heavily traded private shares before the anticipated initial public offering, the value of AeroVolt stock entered a violently steep freefall. It dropped 40% in the first hour of trading, then plummeted past 70% by lunchtime. The massive venture capital firms that had previously thrown endless bags of cash at Trent suddenly woke up to a terrifying reality. They immediately froze all pending financial disbursements. Panicked board members frantically dialed into emergency conference calls, viciously demanding an immediate, independent legal investigation into Trent and his thoroughly useless internal legal department. They desperately wanted to know exactly how a corporate entity could confidently pledge $500 million in state infrastructure without actually owning the foundational rights to their own core product. Desperate to control the rapidly deteriorating narrative, Trent foolishly decided to play his final, desperate card. He dragged himself onto a live broadcast of a premier financial news network, desperately trying to save whatever was left of his burning empire. Sitting under the harsh studio lights, looking pale, exhausted, and remarkably frantic, he aggressively spun a complete fabrication. He shamelessly looked into the national television cameras and claimed that I was nothing more than a deeply bitter, disgruntled former employee who had maliciously stolen proprietary source code upon my rightful termination. He played the victim perfectly, pleading with the public to understand that his company was the helpless target of a vicious, coordinated cyber attack orchestrated by a rogue engineer. But Valerie and I had anticipated this exact pathetic defense. We were watching the live broadcast from the plush leather couches in her expansive corner office, sipping expensive espresso, right as Trent confidently leaned into the microphone to reiterate his ridiculous claims of corporate theft. The legal hammer of the United States federal court swung down with terrifying speed. While Trent was actively speaking on national television, an aggressive team of top-tier corporate litigators representing Meridian Grid successfully filed and secured an emergency, ironclad federal injunction. The news anchor sitting across from Trent paused, touching her earpiece as breaking news flashed across her monitor. Right there, on live television, she interrupted his desperate monologue to read the federal mandate out loud. The court order legally and completely barred AeroVolt from using, altering, interacting with, or even publicly mentioning any line of code associated with my 4 algorithm patents. They were permanently, legally blocked from touching their own product. Trent's face completely drained of color as the anchor demanded his immediate response to the federal injunction. He had absolutely nothing to say. The broadcast uncomfortably cut to a commercial break, leaving his public humiliation permanently etched into the internet archives for the rest of time. Meanwhile, back at the sleek, modern Austin headquarters of AeroVolt, absolute pandemonium had completely taken over. The glass walls that once represented transparency and innovation now felt like a sinking submarine trapping everyone inside. The core engineering team, the brilliant men and women who actually understood the immense gravity of the federal injunction, realized instantly that the company was permanently dead. Without the core technology, AeroVolt was nothing more than an empty, useless shell completely devoid of any actual value. Human resources, the very department that carelessly signed my original licensing agreement 3 years ago without reading a single page, was suddenly overwhelmed by a massive flood of immediate termination notices. Senior developers, project managers, and even the freshly appointed, grossly unqualified chief technology officer grabbed their personal belongings and fled the sinking ship. Nobody wanted to stick around to face the impending federal fraud investigations and the inevitable bankruptcy filings. Within 2 hours of the disastrous television interview, the once proud green energy startup was left hollowed out, bleeding dry, and completely unsalvageable. The highly anticipated North American Smart Energy Summit is the undisputed crown jewel of the annual technology calendar. It is a massive, sprawling event that draws over 10,000 industry leaders, international investors, and prominent journalists to a single, cavernous convention hall. Every major player in the global power sector was gathered there, and despite the absolute bloodbath surrounding his company, Trent actually had the sheer, delusional audacity to show his face. He was scheduled to deliver the morning keynote address, a slot he had purchased months in advance when he still believed he was the untouchable king of the world. When he finally stepped onto that massive stage, the collective murmur of the immense audience was distinctly hostile. He looked absolutely dreadful. The expensive, custom-tailored suit hung loosely on his suddenly gaunt frame, the trademark. Blindingly white smile was completely gone, replaced by a tight, desperate grimace. He clutched the edges of the acrylic podium with white knuckles, sweating profusely under the bright stage lights, and launched into a rambling, defensive speech. He desperately tried to convince thousands of skeptical experts that the recent federal injunction was merely a minor legal misunderstanding, a temporary speed bump on his inevitable road to changing the world. It was genuinely pathetic to watch him aggressively deny reality while his corporate ship was already resting completely at the bottom of the ocean. He never even got to finish his second sentence. A sharp, piercing feedback whine suddenly shrieked through the massive public address system, the audio technicians high up in the control booth, clearly acting on the explicit instructions of the event organizers, completely killed his microphone. Trent tapped the dead microphone furiously, shouting into the silent room, but his voice was entirely swallowed by the sheer size of the hall. Then, the towering, high-definition digital backdrop behind him, which had been proudly displaying his company logo, violently flickered, the green graphics completely dissolved. A deep, resonant bass note shook the floorboards as a massive, sweeping animation washed across the screens, revealing the sleek, imposing corporate crest of Meridian Grid. The heavy velvet curtains at the edge of the stage parted seamlessly. A profound, stunned gasp rippled through the sea of 10,000 attendees as Valerie and I stepped directly into the glaring spotlight. The whispers instantly swelled into a deafening, chaotic roar. The entire industry press corps scrambled over each other, camera flashes erupting like a continuous lightning storm. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked engineer trapped in a tiny, pixelated square on a mandatory morning video call. I wore a sharply tailored, dark charcoal suit, walking with a calm, undeniable, and absolute authority. My footsteps echoed firmly across the wooden stage as we approached the center. Trent physically recoiled, stumbling backward away from the podium as if we were heavily armed. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately looking for an exit that did not exist. I did not even look at him yet. I smoothly bypassed the main podium and walked directly over to the central demonstration console. The exact same hardware setup he had spectacularly failed to operate just days prior. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my sleek black encrypted flash drive. With a single, decisive motion, I plugged my hardware directly into the primary Summit server. I did not need a team of panicked technicians. I did not need to frantically mash buttons. I simply entered my personal administrative credentials and executed a single command line. The massive screens behind us instantly roared to life. The Coordination Core, fully rebranded and entirely legally integrated under the Meridian Grid infrastructure, booted up with absolute, flawless perfection. Complex, beautiful data streams cascaded across the screens, processing a live, real-time simulation of the entire North American power grid without a single fraction of a second of lag. The sheer, undeniable power and elegance of my creation was proudly on display for the entire world to witness. It was a technological masterpiece, and it was entirely legally mine. Valerie stepped up to the microphone, her presence commanding absolute silence from the massive crowd. Before she graciously gestured toward me, I stepped up to the podium. I rested my hands on the cool acrylic, leaning forward slightly to ensure my voice would carry to the very back of the colossal room. I finally turned my head and locked eyes directly with Trent, who had collapsed into a front-row VIP chair, looking incredibly small and utterly destroyed. "True innovation does not belong to the loudest people in the boardroom," I declared, my voice steady, powerful, and echoing like thunder across the silent hall. "It belongs to the people who actually build it." Right on cue, as if my words had summoned them from the shadows, two large, unsmiling men in dark suits stepped out from the side aisle. They completely ignored the frantic event security. They were federal process servers, and they marched purposefully right up to where Trent was sitting, directly in front of a solid wall of flashing press cameras. "Trent Vanderwall," the lead officer asked loudly, ensuring every single journalist in the vicinity could hear him perfectly, without waiting for a coherent response from the pale, trembling man. The officer slammed a massive, incredibly thick stack of legal documents directly onto Trent's lap. "You have been officially served. The charges include massive commercial copyright infringement, criminal corporate fraud, and intentionally misleading federal investors." Trent did not try to stand up. He did not yell. He simply slumped forward in his expensive chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The fragile, arrogant mask of the untouchable visionary tech executive completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces on live television. The audience sat in stunned silence for about 3 seconds before the entire front section of independent engineers and developers stood up. Someone started clapping, then another. Within moments, all 10,000 people in that massive convention center were on their feet, delivering a deafening, overwhelming standing ovation. They were not cheering for an empty corporate promise. They were cheering for the undeniable triumph of the actual architect. I smiled, a genuine, deeply satisfied smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I turned away from the podium, leaving the deafening applause behind me. I walked confidently down the stage stairs, passing right by my ruined former boss without giving him a single backward glance. I was leaving the smoldering, worthless ashes of his fake, stolen empire far behind me, stepping out into the bright, blinding lights to finally take total, permanent ownership of my own extraordinary future. Hello again, dear listeners, and from the very bottom of my heart, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story entertaining and satisfying, I have a very important favor to ask. As I mentioned earlier, our channel has been completely stripped of its monetization, which forces us to stop uploading new videos here entirely for the foreseeable future. We are moving our entire operation to Patreon to keep these stories alive. Please help us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. Over there, you will get to listen to the absolute best, most exclusive, and incredibly detailed true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code currently displayed on your screen. Or you can simply use the Patreon link provided in the description box or the pinned comment below. Thank you again for your incredible support, and we will see you over on Patreon.